All right, so in another video, a previously recorded video, we looked at using string accessors with Pandas. So we saw that if I've got a column that's an object, it contains string values, or at least what Pandas thinks are string values. We can use this .str accessor on the column to have access to string methods. Okay. And there are other accessors. So I'm going to show you a second accessor in this video that I use a lot for working with dates. All right, so I'm importing pandas. I'm reading in our store sales data. I'm doing my little trick to standardize the column names. And when we look at that, when I do the head, so I'm just looking at 2 rows. We see we have a ship date and a order date column, or order date and ship date columns. Let's just look at a few values from that. So let me grab data, and let me grab this order date. All right, let's just print a few of those out. All right, so I like to do this to kind of get a sense of the format of this. So it looks like in this case what we have is a month, date, year format. All right, and a lot of these, very common formats. So I would say that this is a very common format for a date to be represented in. Pandas can work with those very nicely and convert them to a special type called a date time. So if I've grabbed that order date column right now, you'll see that it's just an object, right? So Python thinks it's a string. So if I were to, grab a .loc 0 order date, right? So you can see it's representing that as a string. If I wrap that as a type, or wrap that in the type function, that's a string. All right, but that's a date. And maybe what we're interested in, maybe we want to know the difference between the order date and the ship date, right? Because we want to figure out, well, if people are paying for second class shipping, we're making a certain guarantee that we're going to ship within a certain number of days from the time they order. Are we actually doing that? Or are we meeting our promise to the customer? So we might actually want to be able to work with these things as dates. Right now, if I try to take that ship date column, whatever that value is, so, if I were to just grab data.loc 0, ship date, right? So it can't do that, right? It's saying, well, that's an unsupported operation, right? So you're trying to subtract 2 strings, and I don't know how to do that. All right, so let's see if we can convert these to a type that will allow us to do those types of computations. All right, so let's grab that order date column. All right, so this is currently a string column, and Pandas has a built-in function called pd.toDateTime. All right, now I'm just going to use this in its most basic form, but I do want to note that if I do a shift tab, there's a lot of arguments that you can provide. So if you're dealing with things that come to you in maybe a less common form, like maybe they're specifying the day first, there's arguments that will help you, right? You can actually specify, hey, day first is true, and Pandas will say, okay, when I'm trying to figure out the format of this string and convert that to a date, I'll understand that the first numeric value might be the day. Right, and a lot of times you can just run into some interesting formats that don't match anything that maybe you've ever seen before, and you can explicitly define that format using this format argument. All right, in particular, if you go to format, right, it will point you to some documentation for Python, and if we go all the way down, you can see that there's different types of characters that you can use to specify a format. And I'm going to put some videos up in addition to just doing like Pandas fundamentals. I do plan to do some more applied videos where I'm just using some open data and kind of going through and doing some type of analysis. And I'll try to make sure that I find some examples of some of those more unique date time configurations. All right. So as far as, this PD2DateTime, just the arguments that I find myself using. I wouldn't say frequently, but if I'm going to use the arguments, these are the ones that I'm going to use. This day first and year first, just those are oftentimes some common ways of representing dates that you might see, and using those Booleans can be helpful. This format, again, if I get a really interesting format, I might have to go through and explicitly define that. And then this errors. So it could be that your data has missing values, or it could be that, especially if it's data that someone has like manually entered, it could be that they just fat fingered something, right? The format, in one cell is just not a date at all. Maybe it's got it's a string, right? Maybe they typed hello in there, just got out of sync, especially if they're using Excel. And you don't want this to fail just because it could just be that, hey, that's not a valid thing. So what you can do with errors, by default, if it finds any of those, it will raise an error. It will fail. But you can also say, well, I want to coerce. And what it will do is, in any cases where it can't actually parse that as a date time, it will put a not a time object in there. So it will run, but it's essentially like having a null value in a date time. Right? And again, I'll try to find some interesting examples of that for the applications. But for now, let's just try to run this PD2 datetime. That worked, right? It's really subtle, right? So watch what happens, right? If I just do data order date, it returns a series. And then when I do PD2 datetime, it also returns a series. It formatted things a little bit differently, right? So we see here it's got the year, and then the month, and then the day. So it did do some formatting here, but that's not all it did. The key thing is look at the data type. So originally, when we just do data order date, it's an object. When we wrap that into datetime, now it returns a datetime object. All right. So let's go through and let's convert both of those columns. So I want to overwrite the values in order date with those date times. And then I want to overwrite ship date with that column converted to a date time. All right, now remember earlier we tried to do that difference as when it was strings between ship date and order date, and that did not work. So if I do a data.loc 0, and I say, okay, well, let's get that ship date, and then let's look at the order date. Now we get something. In particular, we get back this time delta object, which is specified in, I think, the datetime library. One of the standard library things. This actually might even be a Python implementation or a Pandas implementation. We can check. Let's look at the type of the thing that's returned. Yeah, so this is a Pandas time delta object. And it's saying, okay, well, there was 3 days between. Okay, well, that's interesting, right? So what we could do now, this is just doing it with 2 particular values. Well, what if I wanted to do it for the whole column? Well, give me back everything in ship date. Give me back everything in order date. Right? Okay, well, now we've got a series that has the same number of entries as our number of rows, and we've got our index labels. So I could assign and create a new column. I could say, okay, well, this is going to be days between order and shipment. A little bit of a long column name, right? But now we can create new columns, right? That are based off of computations from dates. All right. Another thing that I want to show you, because you might say, well, gosh, what is the type of this? It was a time delta. How do I work with that? Well, just like we saw with strings, whenever you're working with objects that are date related and you have them in an appropriate format, you have access to another accessor. So with string, we had a .str. With dates or date times, we have a .dt. These are our date time properties. Okay. So for now, I've got this order date. If I do a .tab, here's the things that it says we can do. We can actually do a few more things in that. It's not showing me all of my options. So let me do a dir. All right. Well, here's the things that we can do. We can get the name of the day of the year. We can get the minutes. In our case, we only had dates, but it'll give us a minute value. We can get the month name, all of those things. Let's look at a few of these, right? So if I wanted to get the month name, right, for those things in that column. Now, this is another case where you're going to have to, you'll run into some errors, because if I run this, it'll say, oh, this is a bound method. So this is actually a method. It's implemented as a method. All right, so that first date was in November. And then, you know, the third, or index label 2, is October. We can do the same thing with the day. All right, so it's Tuesdays. If I want to get the year, right, I think that's actually implemented as an attribute. So again, if you mess up and you put parentheses on there, read the error message. If you get something like series object is not callable, that's telling you it's an attribute, so you don't need parentheses. And if you do something like day name as an attribute, you'll get some, you know, it will run, and the key thing to look for is this bound method at the front. All right, so you have access to things that are for dates. Let's get this days between order and shipment. Now this is going to fail. All right, and why is that? Well, it just worked. We used date time columns, and one thing that you'll have to note is, remember when we looked at we computed those differences, right? So if I grab this column, all right, the type is not a date time; it is a time delta, because we took a difference of 2 date times. So the methods are going to be a little bit different, right? You can always just do a .dt and then wrap that in dir to see, well, what are the available methods to me? Well, I can get the seconds, I can get the total seconds and all of that, so we can get the number of days. So if I wanted to get the number of days, I could do a dt.days. And I think that's going to return just an integer of the number of days between. If I want to get the total number of seconds, represent that as seconds, I could do total seconds. And that's a bound method, so it's implemented as a method, so I need to pop that on there. All right, and once you have the total seconds, you can pretty much get to any format that you want. I will show you one thing that is kind of helpful when you're working with time deltas. So if you've got something that is a time delta, you can actually divide it. So Pandas has a time delta object. So if I wanted to figure out, well, how many times will, you know, 1 day go into that? I can say, well, days equals 1, and there's 3. So it gives it back as a float. So I can essentially divide it by another time delta. And let's look at this. Some of the units I think that we can put in there, we can put days, we can put hours, minutes, and whatnot. So if I wanted to figure out, well, you know, how many hours we're in between that, I can say, well, hours is equal to 1. So 3 days is 72 hours. All right. Now, one final thing, right? I know this is getting to be a lot, is we can do this all at once, right? Again, this is where knowing your types matters. So what if instead of the days between order and shipment, I wanted to know maybe the hours? So remember, here was our 2 original date time columns. When we subtract that, it returns a series, right, that is a time delta. So if I were to think about this and wrap parentheses between this expression, I know that the thing that is returning is going to be a series with d-type time delta. Well, since that's a series with type time delta, well, then I could just divide that by time delta, just like we did a minute ago. All we were doing was taking values that were stored in a column of a Pandas data frame or a series. I can do that all in one go and just say, okay, well, this thing returns a series. So dividing by PD time delta. So it's using the parentheses for order of operations. And that's important because if I take those parentheses away, it will fail. Right? And why is it failing right now? Again, what I'm doing now is it's first dividing this date time by that time delta. You can't do that, right? You can't divide a date time by a time delta. So without the parentheses, it tries to divide the date time by the time delta, and then it's going to subtract that from ship date. So that's not what we need to do. We can only divide a time delta by a time delta. So I need to do my parentheses to say first do that subtraction that returns a time delta, and then that division will work. All right, so again, this might seem complex, might seem like a lot, but they're very helpful capabilities in both the string accessor modes, the datetime accessors, and you'll get used to them, right? So again, with programming, working with any type of technology, in this case, Pandas, a software or a library in Python. I mean, it's a lot of kind of repetition. You'll figure out, depending on your use case, wherever you tend to use Python to help you for, there'll be certain things that you'll find yourself doing over and over. And as you do those, you'll build that muscle memory where you'll have a nice kind of in-memory library of things that you do a lot. And the beautiful thing about code is, again, if you are working with consistent formats, right, if you're always getting the same type of Excel files or CSV files from your information systems or your colleagues, you can write the code to process those, and once you've written it, you just change the file path, read it in, do the processing, and you're good to go. All right, so that is where I will stop this video.